Hey everybody, welcome back to another video. In our first video, we focused on the basic structure of the neurons, and today we're going to focus on why electrical signals can occur in the first place, or ion movement across the neuronal membrane. Once again, I would like to thank Michigan State University for this wonderful book, and Casey Henley for these wonderful illustrations. Now let's start with the phospholipid bilayer, the essential barrier, so to speak. Now, the neuronal membrane is composed of two layers of phospholipid molecules. The hydrophilic, or water-loving heads of the molecules face the intracellular and extracellular solutions, while the hydrophobic, or the water-avoiding tails, form the middle barrier. This arrangement prevents water-soluble ions from crossing over. Basically, the hydrophilic heads naturally orient themselves towards the watery intracellular and extracellular environments, while the hydrophobic tails clump together in the middle, forming the water-repellent barrier, so to speak. Now, this type of configuration is really important because most ions and large polar molecules cannot pass directly through this lipid layer. In other words, the phospholipid bilayer is selectively permeable. It bars or stops the free flow of charged particles, or ions, while allowing some small uncharged molecules to diffuse. And this barrier is what makes the inside of the neuron chemically and electrically distinct from the outside. Without it, the neuron would not be able to maintain different concentrations of ions or charged particles inside versus outside the cell. Now, if somebody is confused about what ions or charged particles are, imagine, maybe from your 7th grade science class, when you rub a balloon on your head, static electricity is generated and the balloon becomes charged with negative static charges. And if you imagine taking this balloon and bringing it close to a bunch of grains of sand, these grains of sand start sticking to the balloon because the balloon is negatively charged while these small particles are positively charged. Now, while this lipid bilayer itself is impermeable to ions, ion channels, specialized protein structures, are embedded within the membrane. And these channels form pores that allow specific ions to move across the membrane when they open. There's a few types of ion channels, first of which we'll talk about are the leak or non-gated channels. Now, these leak channels, they open and close randomly or remain partially open, contributing to the resting membrane potential. And if you guys remember, the resting membrane potential was described in my previous video. For example, some potassium leak channels help keep the inside of a neuron negatively charged relative to the outside. And the next one, and personally my favorite, are the voltage-gated channels. Now, these channels open in response to changes in membrane potential. In other words, when the neurons inside becomes more or less negative than usual. Now, these are very important for generating and propagating the action potential, as we have discussed in the first video. Now, the ligand-gated channels, they open when a specific molecule or a ligand binds to the channel. Now, these are often located on dendrites and the soma, allowing the neurotransmitters released from other neurons to directly influence the membrane potential. One of these types of channels is the lovely AMPA receptor, which is very important in the context of spike timing dependent plasticity and, of course, Susan Shore's device. And last but not least, we have the mechanically gated, or the stretch channels. Now, these are found in some sensory neurons, and they open when the membrane is physically stretched or deformed, like when you press your finger into the table, for example. Now, these channels matter because ions are charged, and they require these channels to cross the hydrophobic membrane. Now, the precise timing and selectivity of ion channel opening is what makes neuronal signaling possible. Now let's talk about the driving forces, which are concentration and electrical gradients. Now, ions diffuse from regions of high concentration to low concentration, or also called concentration gradient, and move towards areas of opposite electrical charge, also known as the electrical gradient. And together, these create the electrochemical gradient that drives the ion flow. Even if a channel is open, ions do not just randomly wander through. They move in predictable ways, and of course they're dictated by the two main gradients I mentioned before. The concentration gradient is when ions move from high concentration to low concentration. For example, if there's a higher concentration of sodium ions outside the cell than inside, sodium tends to flow inward when sodium channels open. And of course, the electrical gradient is when positive ions, or cations, move towards negative ions, or when negative ions, also known as anions, move towards positive regions. For example, if the inside of the cell is negatively charged compared to the outside, positively charged ions, like sodium or potassium, are pulled inward. And when both of these are combined, they form the electrochemical gradient. Sometimes both gradients point in the same direction, amplifying the ion's drive to cross the membrane. Sometimes they point in opposite directions, partially or completely offsetting one another. Now let's talk about equilibrium, or when there's no net ion movement. Ion equilibrium occurs when the concentration gradient and the electrical gradient balance each other out, or for a given ion, when the electrical and concentration gradients are equal in strength, but pull the ion in opposite directions. So at equilibrium, ions still move across open channels, but the net movement is zero. So as many ions move in as move out. And the specific voltage at which this balancing act happens for a particular ion is often called the equilibrium potential, or the reversal potential for that ion. Different ions have different equilibrium potentials based on their respective concentration differences across the membrane, and the neuron's overall resting membrane potential arises from a combination of these ion-specific equilibrium potentials plus the membrane's relative permeability to each ion. Hopefully that was understandable. So in conclusion, ion movement is at the heart of neuronal signaling. It's very important to understand how the phospholipid bilayer, ion channels, and electrochemical gradients interact. It's also very important to understand why neurons have a resting membrane potential and how an action potential can propagate. In the next video, I'm going to be diving more in depth on the membrane potential, so stay tuned for that. And if anybody is interested in discussing neuroscientific topics, you may, of course, join my Discord channel in the description.